speakers. So Andrew Chen from New Zealand Police on Human in the Loop, balancing innovation and accountability in law enforcement use of AI, which is quite interesting. I think I did touch on a bit about research integrity and not so much policing, but Andrew, over to you for your presentation, and hopefully we get 50 minutes of discussion toward the end. Thanks, Andrew.
Great. Tēnā koutou katoa, daja hao, and hello. I'm dialing in here from New Zealand. And yeah, Lindsay Tato to McDonald asked me to come and present a view from a field that many of us might consider to be pretty different on how AI is being incorporated in that work. And while law enforcement and health research might feel poles apart, they do share a similarity in that the decisions that individuals in the process are making and how they conduct themselves can have very significant impacts on the rights and health of individuals. And so that is to say that using AI tools in poor ways can have very serious consequences for people when it's in our hands. This next slide is essentially just to credentialize me as an engineer by training. This is me in the lab programming a robot to play chess because no one else wanted to play chess with me. But from there, I moved into technology ethics, and I've spent 2 years with police as their chief advisor, technology assurance. So this is a role that is trying to help ensure that police use of new technologies, things like facial recognition, number plate recognition, and AI, follow legal privacy, security, and ethics best practice. To be clear, though, I am actually no longer employed by New Zealand Police as of about 3 weeks ago. So nothing in this talk should be considered as being on behalf of police. So before I jump into the approach that we took with AI at police, I think it's worth giving this audience a bit of context as to the types of pressures around technology and law enforcement that we're feeling. And this is the key dichotomy that is always under consideration, which is that law enforcement agencies must balance pressure to adopt technology to help fight crime and keep communities safe against concerns about potential harms that arise from poor use of those tools. And I always point to poor use that can arise in 2 ways. It can either be because the people who are using the tools don't know how to use them well, or they misuse them in bad ways. It can also be because the tools themselves are actually just not very good. And that is certainly one of the issues that we have, is that there is a big gap between the hype and what people are saying tools like AI can do versus what they can actually do in real world contexts. And so when we're asked to think about, well, how do we keep the use of AI safe in law enforcement contexts? There are a lot of frameworks out there for technology and AI adoption, but at least in New Zealand, there's no AI-specific legal regulation that we have to follow, unlike many parts of Australia where there are state laws or even in some cases federal laws. We do have a patchwork of other legislation that has an impact on how we use AI, but the government has decided to take a regulation-light approach in the name of supporting innovation. And what that really means is that there are no sort of regulatory guardrails that we have to follow, which means that as an organization, we have to figure out where the boundaries are ourselves. Some non-generative AI tools have been in use by police for many, many years. Here are some examples of that. And really the pressure to kind of come up with an AI policy is because of the rise of generative AI in particular. And so the initial response to the rise of Gen AI, in particular ChatGPT in November 2022, was in early 2023. Police took the same approach as many other organizations and just put a blanket ban and said nobody's allowed to use it. However, there's very, very high interest internally and externally to be using this technology. And over the course of, about 2 years between 23 and 24, you get this feeling from people that we're, quote, falling behind. It's interesting, the more that I engage with sort of international counterparts, the more that I realize that everybody thinks that they're falling behind everyone else. We often heard this refrain that if the criminals are using AI, then why can't we? And I, have to remind people that the difference between the police and the criminals is one side breaks the law and one side is supposed to enforce the law. But probably the most significant pressure is this pressure to provide a safe outlet for staff who, maybe you could say that they're pushing the boundaries. But in reality, they've got a problem and they want to solve it. And if you don't provide a sanctioned way for people to use these tools safely, then very likely you are just pushing people towards less safe options that are less visible, less manageable, less auditable. And we did find some cases of this. So our cybersecurity team would be scanning emails, for example, and we would look for a particular pattern. Somebody's emailed a document with a bunch of text in it. It goes to a personal email address outside of the organization. And then, about 5 to 10 minutes later, an email comes back with something that looks very much like it was written by generative AI. And that would prompt somebody from cybersecurity to give that person a call and say, hey, did you just send a bunch of information out to a generative AI tool? But that approach isn't going to be bulletproof. We're always going to miss some cases just relying on those sorts of checks. And lastly, there's pressure from government to adopt technology to improve the efficiency and the delivery of public services. And so, there's this push to use AI, but we want to make sure that we're doing it safely. So where we landed was this policy called the Acceptable Use of Generative AI policy, which was approved in March 2025, and we've published it publicly online to support transparency. One of the interesting things here is that it's got 6 monthly audits and policy reviews. Most policies at New Zealand Police are either on a 3-year or a 5-year cycle, and we decided that that was not going to cut it for something like Gen AI. And so every 6 months, we're looking at this policy again to make sure that it's fit for purpose. And so a couple of the features that may be relevant to you, something just for you to draw inspiration from. So here we've separated the approval of each tool, which is perhaps more of an ICT, cybersecurity, privacy, legal analysis thing, from the use cases of those individual tools. So that's to say, how you use a tool needs separate assessment to which specific tools you might be using. And you might need to combine both of those together in some cases as well. People remain accountable for using the outputs of generative AI tools. Basically, we put in the training. We're not going to accept the computer told me so as an excuse for when something bad happens as a result of using Gen AI poorly. And mandatory training. So because it's an organization, we can control people's access to these tools, and people cannot log in to the generative AI tools until they've completed this online training module. And that training module is almost nothing about how to use the tools well, and almost entirely about what to look out for to avoid using the tools poorly. So some of the things that we're worried about are things like bias, hallucinations or confabulation, privacy and information security risks, and also this concept that was raised before around over-reliance. We called it skill erosion because that was a term that seemed to resonate better with police. And then we've got a couple of sort of lines in the sand, right, that say, you can't go past these lines. So firstly, no fully automated use of generative AI. Agentic AI would be the sort of hype technical term, but most people don't know what that is. So we just basically had to say, if there's no human involvement in the loop, then you're not allowed to do it at this point. That may change in the future as this technology becomes more reliable and we find safe ways to do it. But for now, we're just not going to go there. And probably the most important one in my mind, at least, is that we've said no use of Gen AI outputs in any court context. And that's still currently permitted, not currently permitted, I should say, which is to say that that might change over time again. But that's really, court context is kind of the pointy end of people's engagement with law enforcement. I mean, AI is not really relevant at that point in time when an officer is deciding whether or not they're going to use some force. But in terms of, imprisoning a person and depriving them of their rights, we really want to make sure that that process has a high degree of integrity. And right now, if you add Gen AI to that process, it's going to undermine that integrity. Oh, I've skipped way too far by accident by pushing the wrong button. And then lastly, we've asked that users label and acknowledge their use of Gen AI. And this is something that definitely is getting people, it's hard for people to get used to, particularly those who have been in any sort of education environment. They feel like saying that they use generative AI is admitting to cheating. And we're trying to put a positive spin on this. This is not to say that I personally believe this, um, but in order to try and convince people that they should label and acknowledge the use of generative AI, we're trying to tell people that you shouldn't feel ashamed about it because all of the signals are coming from your organization and coming from the government are that you should be using more of this, right? And so if you say that you're using generative AI, then actually what you're doing is very much in line with the direction from the commissioner, the direction from the minister to say, you are using this technology. I'm not suggesting that we should all be proud of using generative AI, but it's just something to think about in terms of encouraging people to actually admit it and to acknowledge that they're using generative AI. Lastly, a couple of small security things. So, yeah, online generative AI tools, the free ones like ChatGPT, are still blocked in the network because we can't have that data leakage problem of data going out to those systems and then just basically being owned by OpenAI at that point. And lastly, really trying to encourage staff to ask for help when they're unsure about risk. And so making that really clear for people that if you're not sure if you're allowed to do this or not, please ask, right? Don't just make the judgment call yourself, but actually ask someone. And that could be your manager, but preferably actually go ask the part of police that's been thinking about this for the last year. And so this is the part that we kind of give to all of the people in the organization to, give them some rules to put in the back of their heads when they're using generative AI tools like Copilot, so that they can think about whether or not what they're doing is okay. The more complicated thing that sits behind that is this risk framework that we're using for evaluating the generative AI tools. And I drafted this and put it in the policy, and then almost everybody hated it because they said this was too complicated and nobody would understand what it means. I left it in the policy anyway because, but instead of asking all staff members to put all of their use cases through this sort of framework, we've retained it as being a framework used by sort of the security people and the privacy people and the ethics people when evaluating whether or not a particular tool is appropriate for use in the organization. And so what this is an approach that's inspired by the European Union's AI Act. Essentially, what we've got here is some risk thresholds up the top. So very low risk, medium risk, high risk, unacceptable risk. And we have applied those against principles that are important to us as an organization. And I think a lot of risk frameworks just have low risk, medium, high risk. It's very important, I think, to say very low risk because there are going to be things that just nobody cares about. It's not a problem. And so, for example, I think I gave the example of if somebody at work wants to create some quiz questions for their team building event, it's very low risk. It's not presenting any level of risk for the organization. There should be a way to allow them to do it. But on the other side, it's also really important to describe what unacceptable risk is. So at what point are you going to have that line in the sand that people cannot cross? And so our approach is that every tool that comes through that could be used either by some part or all of police is evaluated by a team of people who kind of know what they're doing to provide that primary risk mitigation, and then we'll provide an approval scope. So they'll say this tool can be used for these use cases or by these work groups. Maybe it will require an authorization from a particular officer, or people will need to sign an agreement before they can use the tools or something like that. In addition to all of this, it's still mandatory for every user to have done that online training module that I mentioned before they're allowed to have access to the tools. And ultimately, what I'm trying to get across here is that this is trying to achieve a balance where you're letting people use the tools where it is going to be safe, not letting them use the tools where it's not going to be safe, and just sort of evolving from that blanket ban approach to just saying, it's never okay to use this technology, or it's never okay to use these tools. Some people can choose that. It's not mandatory for people to use these tools either. But in practice, if there's no safe way for people to use these tools, then they'll find other ways to achieve what they want to achieve. So just out of interest for people in terms of where an organization like New Zealand Police is going, so we rolled out Microsoft Copilot Chat across the whole organization in June earlier this year, and about 40% of staff have done the training. And I think that this has been really interesting because a lot of senior leaders expected that everybody would do the training immediately and start using it. And I think what they learned is that they were being lobbied very hard by a very vocal minority of people who really wanted these tools. And actually, the vast majority of people are still kind of saying, I don't really see the benefit of doing this, so I'm not going to bother doing the training. That is partly possibly also because we've put in some restrictions, like not being able to take the outputs into court. Certainly, for example, our prosecutorial staff have said, like, if I can't do this in court, then what's the point of doing the training? But at this point, most of it's being used to achieve efficiencies in corporate and support functions. There are certainly some staff members who think that they can just like upload a bunch of case files into Copilot and click a solve button and it will tell them who did the crime. But that's not what it does, and it doesn't work in that way. And so they try it once and then they, give up and don't do it again. In terms of some of the other things that are coming our way, so translation and transcription is a really important use case, and I think translation is really important in particular for helping organizations like police engage with communities that they have not engaged very well with due to language barriers, but also other opportunities and things like summarizing really large amounts of content, retrieving policies and procedures with natural language, and yeah, quality control to improve information integrity. I was really surprised by how frequently officers select the wrong offense code because they type in what happened and then they select an offense code from a drop-down menu and they select one above or one below the one that they intended to select. And if we can use some AI to read what they typed and check that against the offense code, then we can improve the data quality. But just the one sort of last note to leave everyone on, which is this question here. As somebody with technology in my title at police, I often got a lot of questions from people coming and saying, can we do this? Can we do that? And my answer to them often was that technically, and from a technological perspective, yes, what you want to achieve is achievable. The technology could allow you to do it. But the question is, should we do it? And so particularly in a law enforcement context, natural justice still demands human accountability. Trust and confidence is something that's fundamental to law enforcement and is not something that we can afford to lose. And agreeing not to do some things can be just as important as pushing forward and saying, let's go do it. The catch that I put here is that transparency has to be upheld. And this is something that I think a lot of organizations are really bad at, is that we'll all agree to not do something, but then we won't tell anybody that we agree to not do it. And then 6 months later down the line, people go, what about this idea? And you relitigate everything again. You actually want to tell people that you didn't do it and why you didn't do it, so that you can actually get some of that trust and confidence boost from deciding to not do it for the right reasons. So yeah, lastly, the mission of policing can only be safely entrusted to those who grasp what is morally important and those who respect integrity. This is the sort of messaging that we're really trying to push through to people, and try to get them to really think about integrity when it comes to the use of AI. How is it affecting them? How is it affecting them? How is it affecting them doing their job? But also, how is it affecting the people that they're interacting with? Which for police is the general public. But in your context might be, your research participants. It could be the patients. It's the other people in the ecosystem who are going to be affected by the decisions that you're making when it comes to AI or anything else, to be frank. There's an email address for me. Yeah, happy to pass back over to Tam for discussion and questions.
Great, thank you, Andrew. If you can stop share the screen, and I'll ask Michael and Jill to join back on, turn the camera on. And so there's a couple of questions